Hi. Hello. Thanks for joining us today for our conversation with Brad Frost on how design systems help us to work together. I'm Jeremy Zeiler, the director of DigitalGov, and in addition to Brad Frost, we're also joined by the U.S. web design system core team. Dan Williams, who is joining us from Portland, Maya Benari, who's out in LA, and Brian Hurst, who is halfway between us all in the great city of Chicago. Brad is a design systems architect and designer, and he is joining us from his home in Pittsburgh. So we're all over the country. He is the author of Atomic Design, the book that introduced the methodology for thinking of our UIs as thoughtful hierarchies and how a design system can be a guide for your whole organization. So a couple things before we get started. We have a chat box that will be live during the event on the DigitalGov event page. Feel free to use it as often as you like. Brad's going to start us off with his well-crafted talk. And then afterwards, the US Web Design System core team will be taking questions and moderating a Q&A. Just to also let you all know, we're recording today's session. It will be available immediately on the DigitalGov YouTube channel right after the event. And you'll receive an email, if you registered, you'll receive an email immediately after the event with slides and an event evaluation. Please give us any feedback you have, since it helps us to make sure we are creating content that is worthwhile for your time. So now I'd like to hand it over to Brad Frost.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking with you all today. I'm going to try to keep the presentation a bit short so we could spend a lot of time on Q&A. So feel free to type in your questions as you see them. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen here. And just a quick check. Can you all see my screen okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll get into it then. So whenever we like to think about doing our most productive work, we tend to think of something like this, right? We have our noise canceling headphones on. We have a full cup of coffee. We're sort of in the zone and we're able to sort of be very productive. And that's sort of a beautiful thought, but that doesn't really happen all that often, because at the end of the day, right, we have to work with other people because we're creating work for other people, right? And so that means, meetings, that means, constant hovering art directors. That means a bunch of, stakeholder sort of review sessions and things like that, and a bunch of Slack channels where the conversation just sort of never ends. So all that's to say is that we don't work in isolation, right? We have to work with each other because we're doing work for other people. So this is a bit of a talk about how we work with other people, how we talk to each other, how we coordinate with other people, and also how we collaborate with each other. And this is especially, this is a daunting set of questions, because holy crap, you guys make 30,000 websites. Like, the federal government, operates a slew of different websites. And there's infinite amount of decisions for each one of those websites. And so multiplying that by that large of a number is just absolutely nuts. And really, when we get into it, just even if we are working on a small team with just a handful of people, there's all these decisions to be made and tools to choose and architectures to follow and methodologies to follow and all of this stuff. And it's a bit overwhelming. And when we don't have anything in place, and there's a few ways to sort of deal with these conundrums. Is we either sort of just leave it wide open for each individual or individual team to sort of make their own decisions as they see fit. And whenever you multiply that by a lot of people and a lot of teams, you end up with a situation that looks like this, right? You have just sort of this complete chaos, right? This anarchy with cats. And, so when everyone is left to their own opinion, and can sort of choose whatever tools they like and choose whatever look and feel or design they want, sure, you could get things done in the short term. The whole sort of move fast and break things does hold true in that mentality. And then sort of on the other end of the spectrum is really more of a this sort of stifling rigidity, right? This sort of, very repressive, like, okay, we could only do things one way, right? There's only, one style to choose from, or we could only use these tools. And while that's impressive and that sort of helps keep people in line, it's also maybe a bit repressive as well, right? So in this environment, flexibility and creativity and stuff like that is quashed in the name of staying consistent. So really, if we break this down, there's this spectrum between sort of being so wide open where, every team is able to do whatever they want whenever they want, and then the other end of the spectrum, which is, there's one way to do it, and you'll be punished if you don't sort of follow suit. And I tend to think that there's somewhere on this spectrum that sort of allows us to sort of create systems and create ways of working that allows individual teams to be creative and be productive while not sort of overburdening them with a bunch of rules and regulations. So the way I like to see it is sort of, what are the tools and processes and structures and architectures that we can put in place that allows everyone in their own individual projects to understand how they're supposed to be operating, and they could be creative in their own ways, but sort of within certain parameters. So this all leads to principles and guidelines. And I think that principles and guidelines are really, really important to sort of help establish some sense of sort of shared vision, so that we don't end up with a bunch of manic cats going all over the place. So I tend to see principles and guidelines sort of fall on a bit of a layer cake, or Maslow's hierarchy sort of pyramid, where each layer of this of an organization has its own sort of set of guiding principles. And so we'll start at the sort of bottom tier, which is the company or organization sort of level, right? And you have in any organization, you have a bunch of different, departments, right? Sort of huge departments. And when sort of without any principles or guidelines or whatever, in the case of like a corporation or something, it's like, okay, everybody, let's do business. And then everyone in their own respective departments will do business the way that they sort of see fit, right? And they might not be going in the same direction. It's a bit like the parable of the blind men and the elephant, where each blind man approaches an elephant and is asked to sort of define what an elephant is, and each person feels a different part of the elephant. So the guy who touches the trunk says that the elephant is like a snake, while the guy who touches the leg says that the elephant is like a tree, and stuff like that. And of course, none of them have the full picture. So what they're seeing is sort of a skewed representation of what an elephant actually is. And so I see principles and guidelines as being sort of a helpful way to sort of give everyone a bird's eye view, or paint a more complete picture of here's how we do things at this organization. And a lot of this is manifested in things like mission statements, right? So mission statements are often these pithy sort of sentences that define what an organization is all about, right? So Charity Water is a nonprofit organization bringing clean and safe drinking water to people in developing nations. Boom, right? So now everyone who works at Charity Water understands at least what they're trying to accomplish, right? So whether you're in the HR department or marketing or something like that, right? You're all sort of following the same mission. But then also mission statements are great, but they're a little bit abstract. So company values tend to sort of come into play here. And this is Zappos. They sort of have the 10 core values that sort of is we'll say pretty famous. And they have, core values like, deliver wow through service. And of course, they go on to sort of describe what each one of these things are. But also, I like this one, right? Create fun and a little weirdness. And I like that as a guiding principle, right? So if you're working at Zappos, and again, it doesn't matter which department, you're sort of actively encouraged to create fun and a little weirdness, and sort of, again, they define what that is, but that sort of helps everyone that works for that company better understand how they're expected to operate. But really, all of sort of collectively, the collective decisions of an organization are reflected in its culture, and sort of doing some research on this is a great book called The Culture Engine by Chris Edmonds, and he talks about this notion of what he calls an organizational constitution. Like our government has, our country has a constitution. What he sort of promotes is this notion of having sort of an organizational constitution that basically, it specifies the team's purpose, values, and behaviors, strategies, and goals. And I like how he says this. It creates liberating rules that help leaders and team members understand exactly how they're expected to treat each other and their customers. I like this idea of liberating rules, and I think that we're going to come back to this through the lens of design systems. But all that's to say, it helps the entire organization better understand how they're expected to operate, right? What actions and behaviors are encouraged, which are discouraged, and all that. So then moving up to a tier, we now get into a specific department. And so this might be the digital department for you all. But, in a lot of organizations, it's something like a marketing department or something. And inside of a marketing department, you have a bunch of people communicating on behalf of the organization. And so you have all of these different sort of, pockets of people that all have their own skill set. And once again, if you're left to your own devices without any sort of guiding principles, it's okay. Let's do marketing, and everybody in there is going to do marketing the way that they've been taught or told or whatever. But they might not all be aligned, right? So once again, principles and guidelines help sort of align all of these different departments, all of these different people, so that they're communicating on behalf of the organization in a consistent way. And this manifests itself in the form of things like brand guidelines. So this is Ubuntu, which the Linux operating system, and they have a really nice style guide for their brand assets. And so they have things like their logo, and here's how you use the logo. And this is sort of, more traditional brand style stuff, right? Here's how you don't use the logo, right? Here's white space around the logo. Here's our color palette, and here's how you're expected to use those color palettes. Here's our neutral color palette. Here's sort of tints and tones of our color palette. Here's our font family. Here are sort of icons, and here's how you're expected to use those things. Here's these sort of, graphic patterns that we use across our different properties, right? So all of those assets and sort of the documentation around them helps anyone communicating on behalf of the brand understand how best to represent the organization. And then another way that this is manifested is in voice and tone guidelines. And MailChimp, the email marketing company, they put together a really fantastic guide called voiceandtone.com. And what it does is it helps their organization understand when to communicate with users using a certain tone of voice. In certain scenarios, it might be more effective to use. They sort of have like a cheeky kind of brand. So here's an example where, if someone just sent out an email newsletter and the user says, "Oh, we finished this week's campaign. Now I can enjoy the weekend." And they're feeling relief and pride and joy and anticipation and stuff like that. And so what this guide does is say, great, on MailChimp's behalf, right, we want to communicate to them, we want to sort of pat them on the back and say, fine piece of work, right? You deserve a raise. And again, they have this sort of super cheeky tone of voice, and they have a cartoon chimpanzee as their mascot. And so it's all very sort of fun and friendly. But there's also scenarios where you don't want to communicate in a fun and friendly way, right? So if let's just say one of their users just spammed 30,000 people, you don't want the cartoon chimpanzee to come out and go whoopsies, right? You sort of want to sort of adopt a more serious tone when communicating. So these kinds of guides help anyone who's writing copy on behalf of the brand, which, to be honest, oftentimes ends up being engineers or designers or other sort of non copywriter professionals. This helps everyone better understand like how they're expected to communicate. So then we move up a tier into individual teams. So there's, I'm sure thousands of teams working under your umbrella, but the idea is, you're all tasked with your own sort of problems, your own specific goals you're trying to solve, user needs you're trying to meet, and so on. And once again, when left to their own devices, each team is going to sort of put their heads down and sort of rightfully, try to solve their problems in the way that makes sense for their users. But again, this brings up some problems, right? Especially in the long term, in the grand scheme of things. But it really leads to this notion of, sort of special snowflake syndrome. And whenever I talk about design systems, a lot of times people will say, oh yeah, this makes sense, but you just don't understand that we have very specific needs, and therefore we have to deviate, in this sort of wildly different direction because we're special. And of course, everyone thinks they're special and stuff like that. So what principles and guidelines do to sort of help align different digital teams together, it sort of helps get them moving in the same direction. It still gives them the opportunity to solve their user needs to the best of their ability, but also sort of helps them align with it with a bigger vision. And this kind of alignment comes it comes to life in the form of a design system. And there's a ton of different definitions of what a design system is. And I tend to sort of follow a definition that's basically like a design system is the official story of how your organization designs and builds products, right? So, a lot of times I like to put this through the lens of a new hire, right? If a new designer, a new developer is just getting started, they're inevitably going to ask, okay, how do we do things here, right? What should I be considering as I do my job, or what sort of processes or tools or whatever do I use in order to sort of get my job done? And so a design system really is a way to answer that in the form of a URL. And thankfully, we've been seeing a whole bunch of different organizations of different shapes and sizes and industry type release their design systems into the wild. So Lightning Design System is a particularly famous one from the folks at Salesforce. Google has their material design language that they just released an update to. The Carbon Design System from the team at IBM. Here's one that we did for a giant enterprise that sort of lays out, right? Here's our story, right? Here's all the ingredients of that story. And that takes the form of, design principles and sort of spelling that stuff out, high level UX design guidelines. Like, here's how we think about displaying data, or here's how we think about entering data, right? So sort of like form components and things like that, but more like high level stuff. Here's how we consider navigation. Here's how we use color and in what ratio and stuff like that. Here's our code conventions for the design system. But then getting more into the weeds, right? Sort of at the heart of most any design system is this set of reusable UI components that actually sort of, bake in these different principles and guidelines into these low-level components. So here's our form controls, but then here's an individual component, like a hero unit or something like that. And so users of the design system can come to the style guide resource site to get the code to implement this stuff, but also to sort of learn about how to sort of use it properly. So the really exciting thing is that the federal government has a web design system. That is so cool and is a huge task. And so big kudos to the whole team for making this happen. But this is tremendously exciting that these concepts and principles are in play at such a large scale. So these design systems are really there to sort of help define, here's how design and development gets done here. And the audience for these is really anyone that's creating digital user experiences at the organization. And again, there's a whole slew of different ingredients that the design system can include, and it really sort of varies from organization to organization. So we'll talk more about this in a bit. So now moving up the hierarchy here, now we get into an individual team, and individual product teams tend to have, a few different disciplines sort of involved, right? You have back-end engineers, you have front-end people, you have managers, you have maybe a UX designer, a visual designer, a content person or copy person or whatever, QA engineers, all of those people. Once again, without any sort of guiding principles or guidelines or sort of, direction, each of these disciplines is going to sort of do things how they see fit. And once again, those aren't always going to be in alignment. So here we go with our principles and guidelines once again, right? So the design system, as well as a strong sort of project brief and leadership, helps sort of align the entire team to better understand what they're trying to accomplish on this specific project, and to sort of get everyone speaking the same language and moving in the right direction together. And then lastly, the sort of top of the pyramid, I have discipline. And what this is, within any organization, you have a bunch of different people that all sort of do similar things. They're just sort of peppered across different product teams. So, you have a bunch of front-end developers, or you have a bunch of UX designers, and you have a bunch of visual designers and so on. And once again, without any guidelines or principles in place, all of those people are going to sort of do what they feel is the best, right? And again, that means that they're not necessarily aligned with what their other colleagues are doing, and that it might work for individual products, but at the same time, what that ends up doing is slowing the whole thing down, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So once again, principles and guidelines really come into play to sort of help align everyone, so that they're all of those front-end engineers, or all of those UX designers, or all of those visual designers are able to benefit from each other's work and actually sort of speak a common language. That's really, really helpful. So these things manifest themselves in the form of things like code style guides, right? There's a bunch of different ways of architecting things like CSS, there's BEM, there's OOCSS, there's SMAX and other stuff. And so sort of collectively as a group, it's helpful and important to sort of have conversations about, like, hey, is this how we do it here? Is this how we do it with little dashes in between? Is this how we do it with camel case stuff? Is this how we do it with a bunch of underscores or BEM style sort of stuff, or maybe Morse code even? But sort of collectively, you want to define what these different conventions are, and to sort of codify those into a style guide. So then everyone is able to sort of use those same conventions. And so there's less time sort of unpacking what another person has done. And it becomes easier for individuals to sort of move from product to product, and it helps people collaborate better. So, okay. So all this entire sort of pyramid, if done properly, if done well, you should be able to draw a straight line from the bottom of the pyramid all the way up through the top, right? That these low level sort of things like your company mission statement and your sort of guiding values should influence how you're designing and building buttons, right? So in the case of the government, for instance, right, it's important to be a government for all. And that sort of manifests itself in a design principle of being accessible. And that influences how designers are going to choose their color palettes and how they're going to be building their button components and stuff like that, right? So that's the spirit of all of this. And design systems will say, the sort of organizational level sort of stuff and brand guidelines and stuff is helpful. But really, what we're going to concern ourselves with is sort of design systems, which sort of impacts digital teams and all of that. So there's a lot of different benefits that design systems provide. Promoting UI consistency and cohesion. And what this leads to is more conversions and results. The usability expert, Jacob Nielsen, talks about consistency as being one of the most important usability principles, right? When things always behave the same, users don't have to worry about what will happen next, right? Instead, they will know what will happen based on earlier experience. And what this allows us to do is helps users, right? Anytime that they encounter a form, they understand, it's designed in this way, therefore this field is required. Or, here's a date picker, with the little calendar thing, and typically, across many different organizations, right? Every time you encounter having to enter a date, there's some new UI widget that users have to relearn, and that sort of slows them down. Right. And so this disparity, and Maya put this together when the US web design system was being sort of created at first, doing an interface inventory to sort of round up the different sort of styles of buttons that were out there. And this is the result of, again, sort of flexibility that is maybe too flexible, right? Where the same button was being reinvented again and again and again and again. But if you really sort of take a zoom out and sort of zoom out from each one of the 30,000 websites that the federal government operates, and you look at what a button is, there's actually a pretty finite amount of sort of characteristics or variations of a button you can have, right? You have a button, and that button can either be a link, right, that links to another thing, or it could be an actual button element that sort of submits a form. It could have an icon after it. It could have an icon before it. It could be an icon only. It can be maybe a different sort of visual style of the button. It could be a big button. It could be a small button. It could maybe be like a block level button that sort of fills all the available space. It could be a button that resembles a text link, right? But at the end of the day, what you're really left with is by defining a flexible set of UI components, right? That gives some set, menu of options and characteristics and sort of properties. That means that at least hypothetically, right, you're able to solve the needs of anybody who is looking to implement a button. And so that's really, really powerful. And again, that leads to more sort of consistent user experiences. And in the process, it helps lead to a lot faster production, right? Which means that teams can roll out more features and iterations faster than ever, right? Rather than having to every project is 100% effort, right? Subsequent projects become less and less effort. On the Style Guides podcast, we interviewed Federico Holgado, who works at MailChimp, and he talked about this page, which is the status page. And he sort of said that the status page is not a page that a lot of people see, right? It's and he says that we call them the dark corners of the experience. So I love that visualization, right? It's the dark corner of your website. And anyone that's listening, you have dark corners on the stuff you work on, the contact us page or the privacy policy page or whatever, that sort of stuff. We're like, yeah, that's not as exciting as the homepage, right? But he talked about by having a design system, we were able to copy and paste a pattern. We changed a few things, and in 20 minutes, we had built a page that was responsive. It looked great on mobile and was nice to look at, right? by having a pattern that you could use that's already 95% of the way there, it brings up the quality of everything, so those dark corners aren't so dark anymore. So I love that visualization there, right? Just sort of getting things done quicker and to sort of launch higher quality work faster than ever, right? So the other thing, we want to get out of the game of just sort of reinventing the wheel just because we need another button, or we need a card component, or we need this type of navigation, and having to build it again and again, right? So rather than sort of from the ground up having to rebuild these things, wouldn't it be great to get out of, as Micah Godbolt says, the tedium of building the same thing over and over again, and instead focus our energy on more worthwhile tasks, like making things more accessible, or making things more performant, or iterating over things, right? We could focus on the fun stuff rather than the tedious things. And historically, we've never had time to do that stuff because we're rebuilding the card component for the 15th time. Design systems establish a shared vocabulary between everyone that's involved in the success of your digital products, right? So designers and developers speaking the same language, right? That means that you can spend more time actually sort of doing stuff and less time in meetings talking about, oh, do we call this the admin bar, or is this the utility bar? And then, oh, we just call that the gray bar, right? That's having that sort of disconnect in your vocabulary just sort of slows things down. And if you have designers sort of thinking they're building something or designing something, and engineers are building something else, like, that's a problem, right? So these design systems sort of help encourage that sort of shared vocabulary. And Lincoln Mongelo, who worked on the Starbucks style guide, talked about, this common ground that designers and developers are all seeking, right? And a style guide is a really effective way at providing that common ground. As I alluded to earlier, it's easier to test. That means that we're able to sort of focus on making things more responsive or performant or accessible, right? Lincoln talks about this. He says, by being able to sort of zero in on one component, right, you're able to sort of change that stuff at a component level. And then anywhere that component is included in your various products are able to sort of get the benefit of that stuff for free. So rather than hunting down every single input field to make sure that there's a for attribute on the label that maps to the input, you could bake that convention into the component itself, and then anyone that uses that gets that sort of functionality for free. So this helps sort of helps teams be able to manage a huge amount of different components from a more centralized location. It's also a useful reference to keep coming back to as teams do their day-to-day job. This helps teams go, how do we use tabs, or when do I use horizontal tabs versus maybe a vertical accordion, right? And sort of being able to go to the style guide to sort of read about, when to use certain components or avoid other components is really, really helpful. And then the last thing worth pointing out is that this really does lead to a future-friendly foundation. And what I mean by that is that once you have a design system in place, you're now able to sort of iterate and modify and extend and improve it over time, right? As the design system gets used by more products, that all influences how the system is architected. And that's a really, really great thing. So that gets out of the game of, just doing these, burn it all down, ground up redesigns, because at the end of the day, you're still going to have buttons, you're still going to have form fields, you're still going to have blocks like hero units and cards and stuff like that. Okay, so those are the benefits of design systems. And I think that one of the biggest things that gets me really excited about working with design systems is that it allows us to sort of cut like a knife through our sort of antiquated waterfall process. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this, where basically at the beginning of a project, right, we put together these giant requirements documents and really verbose sort of specs and wireframe documents and have a bunch of conversations and approvals over that stuff. And then eventually that stuff gets passed off to visual designers. And then those visual designers, will iterate over a homepage comp for, 17 versions, and all the stakeholders are weighing in and saying, oh, can we change this photo to this photo? Oh, can we change the copy to this? Oh, can we move this from here to here? And then at the end of the day, the developers get like -2 weeks to work on actually building the website, right? So that's an issue. And I think this is especially important because I think a lot of times, sort of the UX design and sort of visual design side, like we focus on sort of dedicating our energy to sort of building these artifacts, when in fact what they should be dedicating their energy to is making sure that design vision, all of that design thinking, all of that UX best practice stuff, it actually makes its way into production. One of the things I joke around about with different teams is to say, raise your hand if you're a designer and you've ever been ashamed to put a link to the live site in your design portfolio. And of course, everybody has a laugh and jokes around about it, but that's the truth, and that's unfortunate. So I think that it's really important to recognize that, especially in the world of sort of front end UI design, there's a huge opportunity to sort of bring the worlds of sort of design and engineering sort of together in the sort of UI code. And so these design systems and sort of prioritizing front end development sort of allows us to work in sort of a more sort of cross-disciplinary, dare I say, agile way. And this means that we're able to, sure, at the beginning of the process, the UX designers are going to be sort of defining what the things are, but that doesn't mean that developers can't get started with their jobs or visual designers can't get started with their jobs. In our own work, we tend to sort of get away with as minimum amounts of static artifacts as we can get away with, I guess. So anymore, our sort of wireframes just look like spreadsheets. And it's actually pretty cool because we're able to just sort of define, here's what this particular page template is going to be. Here's what's going to go on it. Here's what the thing does. And really that's that, right? We're not making any inferences into, UI patterns that we're going to use. We're not making any inferences as to the layout or whatever. But if you actually look at the left column there, that's actually a solid mobile first view of that screen. And what's really cool is that we can quickly get that into the browser and sort of just start building out different components and sort of stubbing this stuff out. And then iterating over those components inside of the browser until we get to something we're happy with. So this is for a project we did with a publisher. And day one of the project, we built out this component, and then the designers started, sort of playing around with different illustration styles and different type treatments and stuff. And so we iterated on this, and then we sort of tightened it up a little bit. And then ultimately, this is what we ended up launching with. And this kind of iteration and doing this in the final environment allows us to be more realistic with what we build, right? So it becomes these sort of tighter iterative feedback loops between sort of designers and developers, and allows us to sort of get things working very, very quickly. And what's especially nice about having this set of reusable, ready to go built components is that we're able to sort of reach for those things, and even page templates, right, to sort of get started with. You're able to sort of bypass a lot of the sort of crap process that resulted in having to create 17 versions of a comp in order to sort of get a final design expressed. Now we can get to a point where we can go into a meeting and have a whiteboard sketch session about what needs to go on the page, and a front-end developer or designer really can take those pre-built components and arrange them onto a screen in the browser and ultimately have something stood up. And so there's no need to sort of go through all of that sort of burdensome, sort of artifact building. And that's sort of uncomfortable, right? Especially if you're not particularly, code savvy, or if you're, you've gotten really good at using tools like Sketch or Photoshop or whatever, sometimes, it's not to say that there's never a place for those things, but it does beg the question of, well, once we have these things live and working, why don't we actually take advantage of that stuff and just get things into the browser quickly? The folks at Airbnb sort of took this to its logical extreme and actually wrote some machine learning software that recognized their different patterns so that they're able to draw on paper or a whiteboard sort of screen or something, and then immediately have that pattern match with one of their working UI components, and it will actually go in and build that in code automatically, which is crazy. Like, that is some next level stuff. And while I don't think any of us have the ability to, well, I shouldn't say any of us, but most of us don't have the time to sort of build machine learning software to make this happen. But I think the spirit is that what we want to do is we want to make sure that the designer's vision and the UX designers, sort of best practices and all of that great thinking that tends to go into an artifact like a PDF or something actually makes its way into the final product. And that really comes from, collaborating and communicating with one another, right? And that really does just beat the pants off of whatever deliverables you end up producing. And also beats the pants off of whatever you call your process, right? Whether that's agile or whatever. So the last thing I'm going to talk about real quick is just about the relationship between the design system and individual products. And Gina Ann, who used to work at Salesforce on the Lightning design system, really said it great, where she says that, the design system informs our product design, right? So what components are available in the design system are going to inform how those products are built, how they look, how they're laid out, and stuff like that. But then in turn, the product design informs the design system. So individual products have very specific needs, and the UIs the UIs provided in the design systems need to meet those needs. So it becomes this sort of virtuous cycle that the design system is able to serve all of these products, but it's not a one-way street. It is a two-way street, and there's a huge opportunity for everyone who is making use of the design system to actually not just use it as a consumer, but also to contribute to it. And so this is, I think, really exciting, sort of seeing this on the US Web Design Systems website, of becoming part of the community, that, even if you're, a specific individual working on a specific project, you have an opportunity to contribute to the greater good, so that your thoughts aren't just sort of locked up in your own product, but you could actually inform and influence the entire organization, which is really exciting. So I hope you're able to think about where you sit on the spectrum of sort of being wide open and totally flexible, and also being sort of totally locked down and rigid. And I hope that you're able to sort of draw a straight line between the guiding principles of the entire organization, all the way through, the top of the pyramid there. If you're interested in learning more about this, I wrote a book called Atomic Design. It's available to read for free online. So feel free to get into that if you're interested in more in sort of like what all goes into making a design system, maintaining it over time, what that sort of cross-disciplinary collaboration looks like, and all that stuff. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Hey, thank you, Brad. I am Dan Williams from the US Web Design System team, and hopefully you can see me and hear me. And hi there. Thank you for your time and your thinking, Brad. It's really great to see you and hear you. And we have a few questions from our chat that I will start with. We have about 15 minutes for questions. And first, we had a question from Lewis King, who asked, does Brad have any tips on retroactively adding a design system into a site or product without one?
It's a great question. And I think, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. And it really depends on sort of how projects tend to get built and executed. So sometimes people are like, hey, we're going to redesign the homepage this year. And that becomes an opportunity to reach for the design system and start sort of integrating that through the lens of that project. And I think that that's the spirit of a lot of getting the design systems starting to get woven into sort of legacy products or applications or something is what work is already happening and how can you utilize the design system's ingredients to make that happen. So sometimes again, if you're having to build a new form, okay, well, that's an opportunity to, go to the design system, wire up the style sheet, start using those form conventions and start building those out. And maybe while you're in there, even if you could sort of sneakily like get in there and say, okay, we're touching buttons, so we're actually going to update all of the buttons throughout. And so you could do sort of a brick by brick approach, but other people will go sort of a slice of a website at a time, right? Feature by feature, or page by page, or stuff like that. But I think the important thing to do is, in order to sort of, you don't want to end up in like sort of Frankenstein mode, right, for too long. So I do think it's important to have a conversation of basically go, great, how do we get this site going from 0% using the design system to 100% using the design system, and sort of mapping out a plan of attack for making that happen. So you might go, okay, in the next quarter, we're going to do the homepage, right? Then this next quarter, we're going to sort of bite off these other pages. And then, at the end of, 5 quarters or something, we will have sort of rebuilt the whole thing. So last thing I'll say is just really making sure that it fits in with the existing work, right? It shouldn't feel like extra work to do the design system stuff. It should just be like, as you're doing the rest of your job, right, you're just reaching for the design systems toolkit to do that job.
So Joelle Florentine asks, does Brad have any experience integrating usability tests or other user research methods into a design system process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And oftentimes what you'll find is there's some really great best of breed sort of implementations of a design floating around in an organization somewhere. And I think the trick is, with respect to a design system, is to sort of capture that and sort of codify that as a best practice, so that anytime someone reaches for tabs or usable, like the most usable tabs, they should be the most usable tabs you have. But sort of the cool thing is, and whenever I showed that, the design system sort of feeds individual applications, those all become huge opportunities to actually test the validity of the UI components sort of contained in the system. So if 3 different teams sort of implement tabs or something like that, and they get a bunch of complaints, and they say, hey, this doesn't work well enough, or I'm a keyboard user and I'm sort of tabbing through and I'm not seeing this, or it's not obvious enough. Those become opportunities to sort of tweak and improve the component at the system level to sort of solve that at the root, and then sort of deploy that back out to everyone who's actually using that. So there's a lot of sort of the user research stuff will end up sort of informing and influencing how individual components are built and the whole experiences that are built out of those parts. And the trick is to really sort of bake all of those findings into the UI components themselves. But then once they're live and out there in the world, those are huge opportunities to continue learning from real usage and real users about how effective those UIs are, and then to sort of go back and sort of feed those insights back into the system's design.
And then to add to what Brad said, for the US web design system specifically, like, this is a big and important part of our own system, and we pretty much depend on getting feedback via our GitHub repo, specifically via filing issues or reaching out in some way. Like, we depend on that to make sure that we're doing the best job that we can. So when you have usability tests and you have findings that you've done for yourself, we want to hear about them. That leads a little bit to a question that I had, Brad, of just how there are lots of people potentially using a design system throughout an organization or a group. Like, how best do you imagine involving system users in design system decision making? Like, how do design systems best develop that common ground that they establish as the de facto standard?
Yeah, it's a tough question for sure, because what ends up happening, and I wrote a post about this not that long ago, about sort of just the intrinsic frictions that design systems, that just come with design systems. And one of those things is that there's a friction of how wide open, or, sort of like, hey, the door's open, anyone and everyone can and should, give us your recommendations and sort of contribute back. And like, that's great in theory, but at the same time, if it's a bunch of sort of, opinions, or, sort of unfounded opinions, or I think it should be this way, I think the whole thing should be green, and therefore, here's a pull request that makes it all green. And so it's like, there's that. Then also, again, more like lockdown, where it's, only this sort of centralized team has the power. I think that it's really important to sort of foster a culture of shared ownership of the system. And again, there's a finite amount of people that can be sort of in charge of sort of making and maintaining the system. And that's just sort of just how that stuff shakes out. If it was totally decentralized, very often those initiatives sort of fall off the rails and people get busy with their day jobs and stuff. So it's really important to have some semblance of a centralized team, but it's also really important to have the users of the design system, right? The people that are reaching for those button components and implementing them in their own products, to feel a sense of ownership over this, that this is something that isn't being thrust upon them or sort of, just shoved down their throat, but is something that they want to use, and also something that they feel empowered to contribute back to, just like we were talking about with the usability testing and just sort of contributions in general. It's like, I'm trying to do this. It's getting me 90% of the way there, but I also need it to do this other thing. And I actually think that might be a good addition to the design system. So I think that people should feel encouraged and empowered to do that, and to sort of set up processes and stuff for actually making that happen in a way that doesn't burden the core team with a bunch of sort of trivial sort of just comments from the peanut gallery, but does in fact sort of open the door for real substantial sort of suggestions and improvements.
How would you describe for yourself the distinction between a design system and a style guide? And then do you think that individual projects or products might have their own style guides, like within a design system? Or
Yeah. So it's a very good question. And so as I tend to define, as I said in the talk, a design system as sort of the story of how the organization designs and builds digital work. And again, there's a bunch of ingredients to that story. Things like the UI components, design principles, icons, so on and so forth. There's a ton of different ingredients that go into it. And I tend to define a style guide as sort of the happy home for all of those ingredients. So as I see it, the style guide is a place where people go. And I sort of elsewhere, I've sort of made the distinction of sort of like, there's like a working environment, and I tend to call that like the sort of workshop environment. And that's where the UI components are actually built and sort of all of that. But then the style guide website tends to serve as like a storefront, right? Here's like, we're putting all of these things out on display, right? We're putting the appropriate sort of descriptions and information next to these components and stuff to make sure that everyone has what they need in order to use them properly. So yeah, the style guide is the home for all of the design systems ingredients. Now, as for whether or not an individual sort of product or sort of a group of products or something would have its own sort of style guide, I definitely think, well, I'd say it's probably not going to be like a fork of like the main thing. I think that that's sort of its own sort of thing. But at the same time, there is absolutely a good opportunity to sort of talk about and codify best practices around a specific product, right? So if one product is very, let's just say like, it does something very specific, passport photo upload or something like that. And there's like a lot of like processing and stuff. There's like, that might not be something that exists in the main sort of style guide, right? The sort of guidelines around sort of how to deal with some of that stuff. So it absolutely does make sense to sort of like have some documentation and sort of, rules and guidelines around like, oh, here's what we need to be considering as we're sort of handling all these different images and formats and the UI conventions around those things and stuff like that. So yeah, so that's great. But I'd say that that's like in addition to the sort of core meat and potatoes design system.
Excellent. It looks like I have time for one or two more questions. We have one from Daniel Demmel who asked, does Brad have any experience with design systems that also include non-digital products?
Yeah, and this really speaks to the extension I talked about, sort of brand guidelines earlier and stuff, and really historically brand guidelines were all print, right? Because this is pre-digital, like back in the days of like Saul Bass and stuff. You have these sort of logo systems or sort of typography systems, or if you look at the sort of famously Massimo Vignelli's like New York City subway system, right? That's like all signage, but it's still a system of sort of creating, sort of conventions for how things like signage and print work sort of operates. And yeah, so it absolutely sort of, brand guidelines tend to sort of hang out at a lower level, which is why I sort of talked about them like lower on the sort of Maslow's pyramid. And so you would have sort of some general conventions around sort of logo usage and, don't chop off this part of the logo in order to sort of fit into a space or something like that. That's a convention that can be followed whether you're doing digital work or print work or something else. But then you do have sort of implementation or medium specific guidelines. So, the digital guidelines for digital work, but then also probably some, here are the CMYK color values, right, for this, that for printing purposes, or here's some other sort of conventions. So there is quite a bit of overlap, and it really depends on the organization on sort of how closely you want those things to sort of coexist together in a style guide. Sometimes some clients I've worked with have balled it all into one. And so there's one resource that is like their brand identity center. And that also includes all of their sort of digital stuff, but also their print stuff and marketing stuff. And then other places, they sort of have sort of separate resources for each medium.
Excellent. I have one more question. It looks like enough time for one question. And that's like, where in the design system is flexibility okay or encouraged?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think that, you all have, higher stakes, especially with respect to sort of, accessibility and stuff like that. So it is really important to just to sort of define where those areas are. So I'm working with a big publisher now that's creating a design system to power 24 very unique brands that all sort of have their own look and feel and their identity. And I tend to see the sort of CSS layer, the sort of aesthetic layer, as being a little more malleable than sort of the architectural, the sort of structural HTML or the functionality of the JavaScript. It's, sort of, so it really depends. It depends on the organization and sort of how much flexibility you need. But ultimately, like, yeah, what you want to do is you want to find the sweet spot between giving the design system giving people the tools they need in order to sort of get things done quickly, but also doesn't sort of shackle them to too rigid of a structure. And a lot of times this comes back to, you know, what I was talking about with buttons, where it's like providing like a handful of variations. It's like, oh yeah, you could have these buttons, and oh, they could be larger for these use cases or smaller for these use cases, or, you know, you can sort of, you know, alter the style of them in this way. It sort of gives enough like sort of levers or knobs to like for individual teams to sort of massage things into place in the way that they need to, but also still works with the grain of the design system. So it's like, how do you build that flexibility into the system itself, rather than going, here's a set of components, and, you know, if you deviate from this, like the whole thing blows up, right? That's not a strong system. So it's like how to sort of marry those things in a way that still allows people to work with the grain of the design system.
Well, that is our time, and thank you again so much, Brad. And it was really a pleasure to hear from you and to hear you think out loud. And thank you to everyone for attending today's event. If there are any outstanding questions, you can email them to the DigitalGov University team, and we will follow up. We will be putting a link to an event evaluation in the YouTube chat box. And if you could take the time to give us your feedback about today's event, that would be really very useful to us. We'll also send an evaluation along via email with slides, video, and any other relevant resources. So thanks again. Have an excellent day. We really appreciate your time, and we will talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.